Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're about to unpack a framework that is dense, highly provocative, and honestly, just fascinating. We're going to be exploring the hidden mechanics of belief, reality, and why society so often struggles to believe the facts placed quite literally right in front of its eyes. Okay, let's dive right into this.
I want to hook you right out of the gate by posing this central, totally counterintuitive paradox. Just think about it for a second. If the documentation for a historical fact is lost in a fire, but then miraculously rediscovered 500 years later, why is our immediate societal reaction almost always suspicion, right? If truth exists independently and it only temporarily loses its physical footprint, we should be thrilled when it returns with proof. But we aren't. The trust completely shatters, and to understand exactly why this happens, we have to fundamentally change the way we look at reality.
All right, part one, truth as a claim, the social interface of reality.
There is a really stark contrast we need to wrap our heads around between truth and evidence. Now, truth is the ontological reality. It's what actually happened or what actually is. But society can't perceive unmediated truth. We can't just magically see what happened in a locked room 10 years ago. So instead, we rely on evidence. And evidence is merely a social artifact. It's the physical trace, the witness, the data stream left behind for us to actually observe. So evidence is our social interface for truth. But the catch is, it's inherently flawed, because it constantly suffers from a lack of information. Traces decay, sensors fail, data gets lost. You get the idea.
So what happens when that evidence inevitably goes missing? How does a statement survive when the physical trace vanishes into thin air? Well, it uses something called backing. Backing is this intentional structural design inside a claim engineered specifically to bridge informational chasms where evidence is missing. It's basically the logical scaffolding, the narrative or the authoritative framework built directly into a claim to make it load-bearing, even when the empirical proof is totally absent.
Now, the crucial point here is how this dynamic alters the chain of custody. In our shared social reality, truth essentially acts as an asserted claim, and evidence is supposed to act as its backing. But when they separate, when that evidence goes missing, this massive informational void opens up. And in that void, a well-designed claim doesn't just sit there quietly. No, the claim actively challenges the incomplete evidence, asserting that the available traces are insufficient or maybe just misread. The claim literally learns to survive on its own authority, completely independent of physical proof.
And boom, this brilliantly illustrates the answer to our opening paradox, because if a claim operates independently in that void, relying purely on its own narrative backing, and then suddenly evidence is found later to support it, well, observers naturally suspect that the new evidence was manufactured or retrofitted just to fit the claim. When truth returns pointing to newly presented traces after a claim has already been firmly asserted, society perceives it as post hoc manipulation. The chain of custody was broken, so retroactive proof is always inherently suspect.
Which brings us to part two, the mythological allegory, Sita, Ram, and the epistemology of trust.
To really ground all this abstract logic, let's look at the ancient epic of the Ramayana. Think of Sita as representing the unbroken essence of living truth, or the core assertion of reality. Then we have Ram. Ram represents the sovereign structure, the social order, and the protective boundary of evidence, which is known as Maryada. Now, as long as truth remains safely within the boundary of evidence, her purity and reality are assumed. Absolutely no external proof is needed.
So let's see how this builds into this massive tragedy of trust. Initially, truth resides safely within the boundary, but then the unthinkable happens. Sita, truth itself, leaves the protective boundary and enters Lanka, which is this unverified external realm. Eventually, she returns to the sovereign realm of Ayodhya. But because truth stepped outside the established boundary of order, the epistemological continuity is broken. The public, acting as the ultimate observer, just can no longer accept her on prior faith alone. Her departure severed the chain of custody.
And because that continuity snapped, returning to the realm of Ayodhya forces truth into a trial. This is the Agni Pariksha, the trial by fire. It's this severe social test demanded by the observers, the public, to re-verify truth after her separation from evidence. Because she was unobserved for a time, the public flat-out refuses to trust her without empirical proof.
Moving to part three, the infinite testing loop. Why one test is never enough. Truth has to be tested, but the test can never be trusted. I mean, that is the ultimate paradox right there. Any testing instrument we have, whether we're talking about a physical forensic sensor, a modern legal procedure, or the court of public perception back in Ayodhya, is inherently flawed, conditional, and totally corruptible. The public doubt itself is a highly imperfect testing mechanism.
And since the test is untrustworthy, we arrive at this simple but honestly devastating mathematical reality. N is greater than 1. Truth is literally never tested just once. If a tool is fundamentally untrustworthy, passing a material through it one single time doesn't give you absolute clarity. So society demands continuous reevaluation. Validation morphs into an infinite loop of testing.
So what does this infinite validation loop actually look like in practice? Well, first, test 1 occurs, and truth objectively passes. Sita passes the Agni Pariksha. But remember, the tester is flawed. The public doubt remains suspicious precisely because they implicitly know their own perception is imperfect. So what happens next? A second test is demanded years later. The whole system enters an infinite regress. It's basically an asymptotic curve, a situation where society constantly approaches absolute certainty but can never fully reach it because the tools we're using to measure it are broken to begin with.
So how does the allegory actually end? When she's demanded to undergo a second test to re-verify her truth, Sita refuses the flawed testing mechanism entirely and just absorbs herself back into Mother Earth. This perfectly concludes the logic. When subjected to endless, untrustworthy scrutiny, truth doesn't fail the test. Truth withdraws from the realm altogether. When a system subjects reality to infinite, untrustworthy testing, it ultimately loses truth entirely.
Okay, part 4, Surviving the Trust Paradox, Application in the Modern World.
So, how does this ancient philosophical logic apply to us today? Well, bad actors, ideologues, and even certain institutions exploit this exact paradox all the time. Here's how. Step 1. Missing evidence creates a natural absence of information. Step 2. Someone deliberately inserts a claim with backing, a highly structured narrative right into that void. Step 3. Because the evidence needed to actually refute it is missing, the claim becomes socially invincible. And finally, Step 4. The claim learns to actively rely on the incomplete evidence to survive. This completely explains why certain dogmas and narratives in modern politics or law become basically untouchable. They thrive specifically because the empirical trace is broken.
But there are some massive systemic risks when we rely on continuous testing. We can call these our epistemological friction points. First up is the stopping rule problem. If validation is an infinite process, when are we actually allowed to stop testing and act on the information? Second is noise accumulation. Repeating a broken measurement often produces noise rather than accuracy. Flawed tests just pile on more bias. And third is directional bias, which is where a well-backed claim selectively engineers the very tests used to validate it, creating a perfect illusion of truth. Which leaves us with this final, profoundly important question. If every test we possess is inherently flawed and certainty is an infinite curve we can never perfectly reach, what is the threshold where we finally grant our trust? When do we stop demanding the Agni Pariksha of the world around us and actually accept the reality standing right in front of us? I really want you to ponder the foundations of your own certainty today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this framework completely changes how you view the nature of truth.